Okay, so you guys can see that what I've done is I've given you the notes for chapter 1. I'll go through it quickly, and then what I'll do is I'll come closer and take a picture of all the boards and stuff so you guys can get that down. I'll try to be short and sweet, but of course you guys know this is my favorite book, so there is a lot we have to talk about. Chapter 1 is important. The first couple pages kind of set the tone for the book. Of course, we meet the main character, Nick Carraway. We kind of get our bearings a little bit in terms of what Fitzgerald wants us to know. Okay, so Nick Carraway is our narrator. We learn a few things about him right away. First of all, he is from Minnesota. He also explains that he is a World War I vet. He just got back from Europe about 6 months earlier in 1920. And then this story takes place actually in 1922. So really when the story opens up, we learn a little bit about Nick's past. First of all, his parents are very Midwestern, they're very middle class. They are kind of the unassuming type people. He even explains that his dad is one of those people that gives him advice about being humble and being himself. And you get the sense that Nick is the type of character that we're going to like, the type of narrator that we can trust. So whenever I read the first few pages, I get the sense that Nick's a good guy. And I get the sense that he's going to be a really good narrator for us throughout the story. So that's kind of the first couple pages. World War I vet from Minnesota. We meet his family quickly. And then he basically says that I'm coming to New York City. Kind of what we talked about in our discussion thread. Right after World War I, a lot of people were getting rich. The country was kind of in this upswing. You had an economic boom. Wall Street was booming. And that lifestyle was becoming very famous. So for Nick, this was really alluring. He's someone who has never had that much money, and he thinks, hey, that sounds great. So he decides to move to New York City the early summer of 1922. And the good thing for Nick is that he has kind of a connection. His cousin Daisy Buchanan lives in New York City, and she's very wealthy. Her and her husband have a lot of money, and he's hoping maybe they can connect me with a job. Maybe this is kind of like my in, and that's kind of his hope. So when he moves to New York, he actually lives in a place called West Egg, which is on Long Island. I'll show you here in a little bit really what it looks like. But it's based on a real place. Okay, so this is going to be a big focus of the book. So he lives in West Egg, and Tom and Daisy live across the Long Island Sound in a place called East Egg. And again, we'll talk about this, but where they live is very important. Okay, so West Egg and East Egg. Nick gets into town the very first night. He goes to the Buchanan's house, and he takes his boat, he goes across the harbor, and when he gets to the Buchanan's, he's like shocked. He can't believe how big their house is, how much money they seem to have. He's known them for a long time, but hasn't seen them for a few years. So, they have this great mansion, and he's really taken back. And he pulls up, and the first thing he sees is Tom Buchanan. And Tom is playing polo there in the grass, really kind of a rich sport. And the first impression of Tom is really important. Nick pulls up, and Tom instantly gets off his horse and comes over and grabs Nick. And really the impression of Tom is he's this big, strong, football playing type guy. And Nick even knew him from college. And he was kind of the type of person that everybody liked but didn't like. And he had all these kind of fake friends just because he had so much money. So he's this big, strong, athletic type of guy, and he's really commanding. He's really one of these people who is kind of pulling people around, and he's grabbing Nick, and you can just sense that Nick doesn't really like this guy, but he has to put up with him. So we meet Tom right away, and one of my favorite quotes from Tom is they get into the house, and right when they're entering, Tom says, "I've got a nice place here, don't I?" And Nick's kind of like, "Yeah, like that's not really something you usually say." So you get the sense Tom is really arrogant, he's really into himself, and kind of loves the fact that he's rich. And they take a tour of the house, and of course there are butlers and maids everywhere, and Nick is just again taken back by how much stuff they have. And as Tom's touring him through the house, they get to the very back end, and there's like this all white room, and like the carpet is white, ceiling is white, drapes are white, couches are white, and Nick's like, "I've never seen such a perfect room." And when they get there, Nick notices that there's, of course, his cousin laying on the couch, and we meet Daisy Buchanan, and it's a very telling scene. Daisy is laying there, on the couch, all folded out, and she sticks her hand out, and she says, "Nick, come over here. I want to meet you." And she goes, "I'm paralyzed with happiness." And it's really interesting. She, asked Nick to come to her. And that's kind of all you need to know. Like, she's used to people doing stuff for her. And Nick walks over, and as he's approaching her, he kind of explains to us the first impression of Daisy. And again, first impressions are important. So Daisy is very beautiful. She is, kind of this natural, evanescent type beauty. She's got this great voice that we're going to talk about eventually, exactly why. And she is just everything that kind of the females of the 20s would want to be. Spoiled and rich, and has all this money and all these maids and butlers and all this beauty, and this husband who has all this money, and she's just laying there. So Nick goes over, and of course she goes, "Do they miss me over in Chicago? Like, I know they miss me since I left." And Nick kind of plays along with it, and he basically says, "I haven't seen you for a long time." And as he says that, of course he sees there's somebody else in the room. And on the other couch is Daisy's best friend, Jordan Baker. And of course my personal favorite character from the book. She gets up, and she goes, "I've been lying on that couch all day, I can't take it anymore." And Nick is like instantly like, "Who's that?" Like, she is hot. He's like, "I can't believe I've never seen someone so pretty." And she is this tall, lean, like muscular, very athletic lady who's very good looking. And Daisy, of course, introduces them. And Nick in his mind is like, "I know who she is. She is that professional golfer that I see on all of the magazine covers." So she, of course, is Daisy's best friend, and we'll introduce her a little bit later too. But Jordan is kind of just like Daisy. She's spoiled, rich, wealthy, and Nick is instantly like in love with her. And it's really interesting. The first thing Jordan says to Nick is, "Where do you live?" And it's almost like, if you live in East or West Egg, like, maybe I'll give you the time of day. If you don't, like, forget it, like, we're done. And Nick says, "I just moved to West Egg." And Jordan says, "Oh, West Egg, you must know Mr. Gatsby." And of course, we haven't met him yet, but Nick's like, "I do know Gatsby, like, he's my neighbor, but like, I haven't met him yet." And when he says this, there's this really awkward pause. And Daisy from across the room kind of says, "What Gatsby?" And Nick's like, "There was just something weird about it." And of course, Nick's like, "I've heard of this guy, but I've never met him yet." And it's kind of this like big secret. And you can get the sense that like Jordan maybe knows and Daisy, but like no one's saying anything. So like I even put down here, like, remember this scene, it's really important. Okay, so we kind of meet Gatsby, but not really. And suddenly Tom comes back in the room, and he's, of course, like he always will be, he's holding this big thing of alcohol. He's like, "Let's go, nonsense. We're going back, and let's get on the porch and let's eat some dinner." So he like pushes everybody outside. And I put here too, alcohol is going to be a big symbol in the book. I mean, of course, we all know Prohibition was during the 20s. So alcohol is illegal, but of course Tom always has it. And he's like obsessed about always drinking. So kind of shows about his character. So he like pushes everybody outside, and when they get outside to the patio, they kind of get acquainted with each other. And it's maybe a few pages of them just talking, kind of, I don't know, reacquainting themselves. And one of the weirder scenes, and it always makes me laugh because how stupid it is, suddenly Tom just stands up and he goes, "You know what's wrong with society these days?" And Nick is kind of like, "What are you talking about, dude? Like, we're just chatting. What are you saying?" And Tom says, I'll tell you what's wrong with America. It's the fact that we are letting white people and black people intermix. Like, if you want to keep America great, you have to separate them. And even Daisy is like, "Come on, man. Like, who cares? Like, who has to be that outwardly racist?" And Nick even says, like, how stupid that was. So it just kind of shows Tom's just a jerk, and he can't help it. And Nick and him don't get along. And he even like says, "No, it's all proven. There's that book, The Rise of the Colored Empires, by that guy named, Stoddard." And he alludes to a book. And if you research it, there was actually a book written in the 20s called The Rise of the Colored Empires. But Tom mispronounces the title and the author. So it's kind of like Fitzgerald having a little funny scene here. Like, Tom's trying to be this really smart, intelligent guy, but he's really dumb. And Nick's laughing in his mind. So it's kind of this interesting little scene here. And suddenly the phone rings. And like everybody stops. Of course, you gotta realize phones were new in the 20s. And this was kind of, I don't know, proves that they were very wealthy. So the phone rings, and Tom immediately like runs away and goes inside to answer it. And all of a sudden, Daisy starts crying. And Nick is like, "Why is she crying?" And then all of a sudden, Daisy runs into the house to chase after Tom. And Nick is looking at Jordan like, "What's going on here?" And Jordan goes, "Shh, don't talk. Like, they're having a fight, let me listen." And Nick's like, "A fight? Like, what about?" And like, this is kind of the first big bombshell of the book. Jordan says, "Oh, I thought you knew. Tom has a girlfriend in New York, and she calls like every night, and it must be her." And Daisy gets kind of upset. And Nick is like, "What are you talking about? Like, why doesn't anybody say anything? Or why does Daisy know? Or like, why is Tom doing this? Like, it takes a lot of guts to have a girlfriend and have all this money and have a great wife and like be outward about it." So it's kind of, again, the first big thing that we learn, and Nick doesn't quite get it. And then Daisy returns, like wiping her eyes, and Nick doesn't know what to say. So Daisy suddenly like changes the subject. And she goes, "Nick, can I tell you about my daughter? I have a daughter named Pam. She's like 2 years old." And this is kind of an interesting insight into Daisy's character. She starts to explain, when my daughter was first born, when I first came out of the anesthetics, I asked the nurse, "Is it a boy or a girl?" And when the nurse said that I had a girl, I like instantly began to cry. And Nick says, "Well, why did you cry, like about your daughter?" And Daisy says, "Well, all girls can be as beautiful little fools. Like, I guess that's all she'll amount to." And Nick kind of gets it now. Like, maybe that's how Daisy views herself, just as like this trophy wife who has no emotions or no say. And like, it's kind of an interesting fact about the women of the 20s. They kind of view themselves as having like no say. And this is something we talked about with that discussion thread. Sometimes females felt this way, and in the 20s, it was kind of that first decade of them having freedom. So you're going to see Daisy start to try to be herself, and not really what Tom wants her to be. So kind of that first little hint of it here. And Tom returns, and he's acting, of course, like nothing's going on. And Nick doesn't quite know what to say, so he like looks at his watch and he says, "Oh, I get it. Like, it's too late now. Like, I have to leave." And Tom tries to get him to stay. And Nick says, "No, it's late. Thanks for dinner, but like I have to work in the morning." And Like I have to, hit the streets. So Nick starts to leave, and Tom grabs him, and he says, "I'm going to pick you up tomorrow morning. I want to take you to lunch to New York City." And Nick kind of says, "I don't know." And Tom says, "Nonsense. I want you to meet my girlfriend anyways." So Nick again is like, "What the heck is going on?" And like Nick kind of agrees and kind of doesn't. Tom's like, I'll pick you up in the morning." And Nick says, "Oh, okay." And Nick leaves. And he's like going back towards his boat, like thinking, what the heck did I just get myself into? And when he leaves and he goes back home, again, it's like late at night now, and he returns back home to West Egg, and there's something off. And he gets outside of his boat, and he notices that there's a figure outside of his dock, like staring. And Nick is like, what the heck? And he sees that it's this figure who he assumes is maybe Gatsby. I mean, it's right outside of Gatsby's house, who is staring. And I'll do this for you guys. I'm getting old, so I can maybe do it still. But there's this figure like standing, like shaking, looking out towards the water. And Nick is like, what? What is this? And Nick looks out towards the water, and he sees like this weird green light, like flashing outside of the water. And then Nick looks back at the figure, and the figure's gone. And it's like, what the heck just happened? And this is kind of a fitting end to chapter 1. You have all of this mystery about Gatsby. You have all this stuff that just happened to Tom and Daisy's. You have Nick, who's just new into town, like kind of can't get his bearings yet. And then he returns home and sees this weird figure who is probably Gatsby, and this green light, and he disappears, and like it's just way off. And this is all new to Nick. He's really not sure, like, what the heck is this all about? So it's, of course, a lot goes on in chapter 1. You'll see, I'll try to keep these short, maybe 10 minutes or so, just so we can kind of talk about each chapter. What I'll do is I'll take a quick video picture of the notes, and there's one quick thing I want to talk about too, in terms of the setting of the story. Okay, so we'll do that. Here is going to be chapter 1 notes. I'll hold it there for a second. So chapter 1, and again, make sure you get all this stuff down. And there's the end of it. I'll try to keep it to maybe a board and a half or whatever. And I also want you to get this stuff down too, when we talk about the setting here. Let's see if I can set this down here. Hold on one second. This is going to be important too. There we go. So real quick, in terms of the setting of the story, here's West Egg Harbor, and so this is all Long Island. Okay, so if you've ever been to New York City, you have New York City, and it's maybe a half hour to the east of the city is West Egg, which is Long Island, and East Egg, which is Long Island. And Long Island has multiple different communities, but these are two of the more famous ones, and they're really well known for being very wealthy. And if you read this story in the 1920s, you'd kind of get it. You have two different communities, and they were kind of rivals. West Egg was known for being the quote-unquote new money. You had people who were just recently wealthy. Maybe they're working on Wall Street. Maybe they just started a business or whatever. So West Egg was full of people who are kind of more hardworking, more down to earth. People like Nick Carraway. People like maybe that aren't as rich but are getting there. So that's West Egg Harbor. Then you cross Long Island Sound, and you have East Egg Harbor. And that is, of course, where Tom and Daisy live. And they are considered what the term would be old money. And what old money means is people who have families who have passed down money from generations on. So the Buchanans are extremely wealthy. I mean, Tom Buchanan's family has been rich for decades in America. And he really, to be honest, doesn't even have to work. So that's kind of the, contrast of the two communities. So it's kind of fitting that Nick lives in West Egg. And he just, kind of the reason he does is that's the only place that was available. And when he moves into town, he just happens to live next to this Gatsby guy. And again, Nick's never met him yet. He's heard rumors about him, but really he doesn't know, what's this guy's deal. The only thing he knows is that every Saturday night, this Gatsby guy throws a big party where he invites all of the rich, famous sports stars, actors, actresses, Wall Street people to his house. And he has a big, huge party every Saturday. So anybody who's anybody attends. And as you can see, I kind of drew it to scale, but he has the biggest house in all of Long Island. So he has this, this rock star type of status. But there's kind of a key here. Gatsby has never gone to his own parties. So no one knows him. No one's met him. He's kind of like this man behind the curtain, like the Wizard of Oz type thing. And the only thing is, Nick will eventually get to know him. So that's going to kind of be where the plot's going to, of course, go. But we haven't met him yet. So that's where Nick lives. Tom and Daisy live in East Egg. What's going to happen in chapter 2, Tom is going to go over and pick up Nick, and they're going to go into New York City for lunch. But of course, really to meet Myrtle, his girlfriend, which we'll get to in chapter 2. Okay, so that's going to kind of be what I'll do every day for our notes. I'll try to keep it short and sweet, but of course there's going to be a lot we have to talk about. Okay, so that's chapter 1. I hope you guys watched. I hope you do your notes. If you have any questions, let me know. Okay, chapter 2 is next.